in UCD, so I'm rather unusual that I'm split between two schools. It's a 60-40 split, which is an interesting way to put it. I'm also co-director of the Centre for Irish Towns, which is hosting this this webinar series in collaboration with UCD Earth Institute. And I'm going to be chairing today's webinar. So the aim of the Centre for Irish Towns is obviously to build a network of people that are interested in Irish towns and to generate conversations about the challenges facing Irish towns and the role of research and of policy in addressing them. And so these Talking Town webinars are just one mechanism for doing that. And the series is curated by Katrina Devery and Sarah Cotterill, who are both on the working group of CFIT. So our thanks to them for organising today and the other events. The webinars are going to take place on the first Thursday of each month, except for this one. There's always an exception within each trimester. So they're each going to have a different theme or a different focus. The next one is on the 3rd of November. If you please put that in your diary. It's going to focus on transport and mobility. And then there's one following that on the 1st of December on high streets. And that one is actually going to be a joint webinar with the University of Edinburgh. We have a collaboration with the University of Edinburgh, the Edinburgh Futures Institute, called Nations of Towns. So today we are focusing on the weird and complex world of vacancy and Irish towns. I'm quite sure this is a topic that all of us are very familiar with, vacancy and dereliction. So unoccupied or uninhabitable buildings are very prevalent in all of our towns and cities, and have been very much and are very much in the public discourse, in the public eye, and in the media and in social media, and that's been the case for many years now. And the extent in Ireland of vacancy and dereliction is to a large extent unknown, and it is disputed a lot of the time, and there are widespread tangible social, economic and environmental impacts depending on what lens you're approaching the issue with. So today we are very lucky to have two distinguished speakers who are going to shed some light and clarity onto this issue of vacancy and dereliction in Irish towns. So we have Cian O'Callaghan from Trinity and Ali Harvey from the Heritage Council. The structure is going to be that I'm going to give a very brief introduction, and to each speaker. There are extensive online bios that you can look at your leisure, and we're going to go with the order that's advertised, which is Cian and then followed by Ali. I'm going to leave questions and answers to the end, if that's okay, but please do put comments and questions in the chat. That's the best tool we have for interacting. It doesn't have to be a beautifully crafted question. We are not grading them, but something comes into your head, please put it up there. It would be helpful if you could make it clear who the comment or question is directed at. That would help me and will also help the speakers. And also just to say that this webinar is recorded and will be available at a later date on the CFIT website. Okay, so we get started. Our first speaker is Dr. Cian O'Callaghan. First thing to say about Cian is that he is not a TD and he is not the Social Democrats housing spokesperson. This is a different Cian O'Callaghan. The Cian O'Callaghan we have today is much more interesting. He is the Assistant Professor in Urban Geography at the School of Natural Sciences in Trinity. And Cian, you've been in that role since 2016, I understand. Previous to that, Cian was working for 8 years in NUI Maynooth as a lecturer in geography and a postdoctoral research fellow at the National Institute for Regional and Spatial Analysis, NIRSA. And Cian's PhD is from University College Cork. Cian's expertise is in urban politics and urban governance around issues including regeneration, housing and urban vacancy. And there's numerous publications that Cian has, and they are all listed on his Trinity profile. And they include a chapter on housing and vacancy written with Kathleen Stokes in a book that came out very recently, edited by Lorcan Sir, called Housing in Ireland Beyond the Markets. Cian has been awarded numerous research grants that I'm not going to go through, but the most recent, well, one of the most recent ones is an IRC Coalesce program funding award on the topic of rethinking urban vacancy. And I suspect that Cian is going to talk to us about that today. So Cian, I'm going to hand over to you now if you want to share your screen.
Great, thanks Philip, and thanks Philip and Orla and Katrina and Sarah for inviting me. So I'm just going to share screen, and hopefully that sort of comes up and people can see it. I can't go onto slide view, unfortunately, as it's tilting it into a portrait for some reason. So in the short presentation today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Rethinking Urban Vacancy project, as Philip mentioned. So this is an IRC Coalesce funded project that ran from 2019 to 2021, and it's collaborative research with Kathleen Stokes, Maeve McLaughlin, and also Dublin City Council as a policy partner. So our focus here is broadly on cities rather than on towns per se, but we think that sort of the geographical focus on thinking about vacancy can also shed some interesting light maybe on the town specific factors. So the project had two key questions. So firstly, it was looking at how urban vacancy is categorized and measured in the Irish context, and how we could new forms of measurement might lead to more effective policy solutions. And the second question then looked at the underlying structural and contextual factors that contribute to production of vacancy in its different forms. So really our entry point here is thinking a little bit critically about sort of how we do measurement in Ireland around vacancy and what that measurement allows us to see, maybe critically what it doesn't allow us to see. And then secondly, to think about some of the barriers to bringing vacant stock back into use, and looking at that question sort of in relation to a couple of geographical areas. So I just want to try to make three key points in the presentation today, and I'm summarizing them here just in case I'm not clear enough and I don't really kind of I don't get a chance to reinforce these so much in the presentation. So the first is that measurements of vacancy in Ireland have limitations and can be difficult to operationalize. And I'll talk a little bit about kind of how we do measurement, what did some of those things allow us to see. Secondly, that the barriers to addressing vacancy are interrelated and interdependent. So we often think of sort of, the addressing of particular types of solutions. And if we can only do this or that, we can, unlock that challenge or that problem. And what we've kind of found in our research is that some of those factors are very much intertwined and they influence one another. And the third thing is the causes and solutions to vacancy have a geography. And so we looked at three cities, Dublin, Cork and Waterford, and each of those cities have very different market dynamics, for example, going on that will influence the form that vacancy takes and the types of solutions that might be appropriate. So to kick us off, a lot of the public discourse around vacancy tends to sort of see vacancy as a visibly manifested thing. So we look at a vacant building and we see that it's empty, and we think that's a simple kind of thing of disuse and abandonment. But rather, when we kind of get under the skin of vacant buildings, it uncovers and reveals a lot of overlapping different kinds of factors relating to issues of urban governance, to property ownership and property rights, to how we measure and count vacancy, to the dynamics of property markets as they operate in different cities and towns, to issues relating to financing and the availability of financing for different types of refurbishment or reuse, health and safety regulations, fire standards, and also sort of development trajectories and more speculative approaches to development. So vacant building then sort of raises a lot of complex questions, which we would argue from a kind of research perspective don't always get a lot of attention, or maybe are not understood very clearly from a research perspective and from a policy and public perspective as well. So the first question we sought to ask is about how we measure vacancy currently in the Irish context. And we sort of started from that approach, I suppose, in terms of thinking, what does that sort of data, in terms of how does that data feed into our understandings of that issue? And then sort of how can we learn from, a more critical look at that data? So I'll open with a kind of quote from a national government official here, which suggests the way in which vacancy is often approached as a particular policy challenge, maybe in relation to a particular thing they're trying to do. So they said that, well, the most crucial or critical thing was the fact that vacancy is predominantly a temporary or short-term issue for any given property. We're not interested in knowing Johnny's house down the road is for sale. What we're interested in is Johnny's house down the road, there's nobody living in it today. 6 months later, there's still nobody living in it. A year later, there's still nobody living in it. Now we're interested in it. And so what this quote kind of suggests is, firstly, it suggests that vacancy, in terms of what we measure and how we understand it, that there's not very good maybe approach to understanding kind of the issue of vacancy as a whole or overall as something which maybe impacts the urban realm. But broader vacancy is often addressed through very specific policy goals. And over the last number of years, the primary goal is really about sort of bringing vacant housing stock back into use, and primarily for social housing. So we see reflected in this quote some of the ways in which government approaches to vacancy have been about identifying potentially available stock that could be quickly brought back into use. And so this tells us a little something about sort of the policy approach. So one of the things we did was we did a data audit of the sources of data measurement around vacancy in the Irish context. We looked at sort of local, national measures and other sort of crowdsourced measures around that. A couple of things to say, maybe just in terms of the overarching figures, and we often hear figures from the census and geodirectory thrown around in terms of national figures. So both of these, they're both static measures to a certain extent, geodirectory more frequently, and the census every 5 years. There's quite a lot captured within those measures. So what's vacant in the census is effectively, a non-return of a form from a census form on that night from that property. So really kind of in both of these cases, to a greater or lesser extent, vacancy data is a sort of secondary data, or a kind of form almost of data exhaust that is created by trying to firstly achieve other data sources or measurements. So that kind of alerts us to, I suppose, some of the ways in which there might be limitations in what the data allows us to see or allows us to know. So in terms of looking across these sort of data sets, and these data sets kind of capture very different things. They tend to define vacancy in maybe different ways. And also vacancy as a more general thing is kind of notoriously difficult to kind of capture, because sometimes there's an assumption that vacancy is long-term vacancy, and that's not often the case. And there's also, a difficulty in maybe capturing some of those dynamics within a market context in particular. So some of the kind of limitations that we encountered, or in terms of thinking about those different kinds of data sets, was there's often an aesthetic emphasis for identifying vacancy, which may or may not be accurate. Some forms of measurement are more recent, and some are, only a sort of, are not kind of on a continuous basis in terms of that measurement or that data. There's an issue relating to kind of static versus ongoing measures, and what do those different kinds of measures allow us to see. Some types of vacancy are more easier to identify, are more policy relevant. So that also opens questions about how you might do different kinds of measurement for particularly problematic types of vacancy as one kinds of entry point or solution. And there's often a conflation, as I said, with sort of with long-term vacancy and with sort of homes that are, available to come back into use, and that there's a series of kind of barriers or challenges around housing condition, around the location of housing, etc., in relation to this. And finally, then there's limited data set integration, and there's ways in which that could help, I suppose, in terms of providing a quicker route through the data to be able to maybe predict or identify vacancy in different ways. So just say something quickly then about sort of some of the barriers to reuse. So one of our things that we've done with the project in relation to kind of thinking about some of those limitations of the measurement and what those measurements allow us to see is that we created a provisional typology of vacancy, particularly focused on Dublin, which relates to a number of different ways in which vacant properties might be vacant. And we're particularly talking about homes really for a large extent here, but also including some vacant sites. And so this is one way in which we could think about maybe sort of increasing the kind of granularity of the data, and also thinking a bit more situatedly about sort of policy responses. In terms of sort of barriers then to reuse, we did a lot of interviews with policymakers and other people who were actively involved in trying to bring properties or land back into use which had been vacant. And a number of common factors come up, which is being reinforced in other people's work, like Phillips and Orla's and others. So planning and regulatory factors around kind of fire, conservation, land use zoning, and also market factors then around things like land value, construction costs, financing. There's also questions which are raised here around sort of governance capacity around implementation of these things. So we often hear kind of concerns about sort of people should do something about vacancy, but it's often very unclear about where the responsibility for doing something might lie. So a couple of sort of, I guess, overarching things that we might think about in relation to barriers, and we might think about in relation to those kind of structural or contextual factors about bringing vacant stock back into use. So firstly, I think we need to start seeing vacancy as operating within planning systems and property markets. So vacancy is often thought of as something which is kind of a planning failure, which in a way you could consider it to be. But when we kind of look at some of those dynamics, these are very much active sites that are engaged with. There are owners, there are kind of people with plans, etc. So we think about those as operating within those dynamics. There's interrelated planning and property market factors will influence the value and costs associated with sort of bringing vacant properties or land back into use, which is a real big factor in terms of what's seen as kind of viable. And therefore, kind of what are the challenges maybe associated with trying to, carrots and sticks approaches to incentivize reuse. And as I said, there's further questions then, which I'm not really going to go into here, but around governance capacity to implement these sorts of policy things. So I just want to kind of finish by just touching on two things maybe briefly, which just give a little bit of a flavor of some of the interviews and some of the kinds of issues that came up. So first is around sort of the interrelated and competing barriers that we might think about. And so I have a quote here from a local authority official who suggests that I met an architect involved in a particular development, and I was saying, well, under the bringing back homes thing, you keep it as if you keep a property as a single unit, you won't have to worry about fire standard upgrades, and you won't have to worry about insulation for sound. You can just sidestep a load of expenses and complications. So now they've gone in for planning and they're splitting it up into 2 units. It means taking out the stairs. It's a lot of work, in terms of meeting fire regs and minimum spacing and all that stuff. And to me, what this kind of quote suggests is that on the one hand, we see sort of fire safety, accessibility, conservation barriers as being something which is a factor in disallowing stuff to be brought back into use. And there's policies and schemes which are brought in to sort of make some of those easier. But on the other hand, we can see the sort of overlapping then or intersection between maybe issues around land value and around sort of rental yield that might come back from a property, and also around the availability of financing to how you kind of make it redevelopment of that single site work. So I don't know the kind of exact reasons of the landowner and what they kind of went the route of splitting it up into 2 separate apartments, but we can think about these as the sort of factor then, and these as overlapping factors which influence each other in terms of any particular site, which does speak to how there is a complicated kind of process involved in bringing stock back into use then in these contexts. Second point I just want to highlight then is around compulsory purchase orders. And so compulsory purchase orders are often seen as firstly, one of the key mechanisms that are available to local authorities to bring stock back into use. But there's maybe a little bit of a kind of public lack of awareness about the process and how this works. A couple of things to flag maybe. So one is the idea that sort of compulsory purchase is often thought of as the local authority buying a property and taking it on and sort of taking in charge of the sort of the taking charge of the responsibility of bringing it back into use in some ways, retaining ownership, where CPO has often been used through the Derelict Sites Act as a way of sort of buying off one owner, transferring to another owner who's going to redevelop it. So it's often a way to kind of kickstart redevelopment. Secondly, CPO, as probably people are aware, is a convoluted process, can often get kind of held up in courts, can take a long period of time and often get thrown out. So a couple of quotes here. So I've got a flow chart which looks through maybe the various stages in which a CPO might work with regard to the vacant sites register and that levy in a kind of ideal context here, which you may or may not be able to see. And just a couple of quotes then, which may be from local government officials, which speak to some of the complications there. So one says that derelict sites process had been used to try to work with landowners and property owners quite well, but the vacant sites wasn't designed to do that. It was designed very much to be a use it or lose it, but has in a lot of ways slipped into that kind of method of consulting landowners and trying to kind of engage in a partnership approach. And so some of the limitations from a kind of clarity of policy perspective there. And then second, then another official suggested in the sense the paperwork for CPO isn't a big deal. The one thing that's really important is being sure that you have a clear plan for everyone agrees on before something is acquired. And what they mean by this is a plan for whether the local authority is going to retain ownership of that site, seek to redevelop it, what are the costs associated with that, or whether they're going to try to kind of line up another property owner or developer to take charge of that. And these are often kind of complicated issues that are not properly maybe worked out in some of the discussions or some of the assumptions about CPO in the first place. I won't talk about this, but just to finally kind of say that Vacancy does have a geography, and in the 3 cities that we looked at, there are quite different market and planning dynamics that are going on here, which have influenced both the types of vacancy that appear in those cities and the ways in which policymakers there have been able to address that in terms of solutions. And I think Ali is going to be able to speak much more clearly than me on the issues specifically relating to towns in this regard. So I'll leave it there, and thank you.
Great, thanks, Cian. It's great that that piece of work now exists and is available to provide clarity on all sorts of different issues, as you've explained, from the different data sets that exist. I love this phrase of de facto data exhaust, so that we're not actually going in to measure the vacancy. It's just a byproduct of another process, and that is mirrored in other countries, actually. In some other countries, and to get this typology of urban vacancy. Am I right in thinking that your main methodology was actually talking to the people involved with trying to map or trying to get properties back into use? It was a sort of interviews.
So it was kind of, there's 2 sets of methods, I suppose. So one, as I said, was this sort of data audit where, you know, it's a very simple thing, I suppose, just looking at in a bit of detail what's out there, what does it measure, what doesn't it capture. And that included kind of measures that are ongoing and some that were a bit more, you know, say, for example, like the reusing Dublin site, you know, which operated for a period of time and it kind of went, maybe is less active at the moment. And then also kind of talking to some of those data producers. So like about what the considerations were in terms of what, you know, fed into, you know, their approach to that data collection. And so, for example, we had good discussions with the CSO about some of the more recent changes which they've implemented. And you see some of that information coming out now where they have a more granular set of data collected on housing vacancy, about the reasons for vacancy, which would be very useful, I think, in terms of informing maybe that discussion, and could link a bit with some of the concerns we have around typology. And then a lot of the methods, they're very much kind of interview based, involved in targeting kind of people at sort of national level, local level, some actors within the market, about how they would differently approach the issue of vacancy, but very in particular kind of talking through people who are engaged in a kind of policy or, you know, otherwise in kind of actively trying to bring stock or sites back into use, and really trying to understand what are some of the barriers and complications.
From their lived experience. Okay, Cian, thank you very much. We will save questions and answers until after Ali's talk. So we'll move on to you now, Ali. How to introduce Ali Harvey. So Ali is program manager at the Heritage Council. So Ali's running the Heritage Council's planning and regeneration programs. Ali is a tireless and a really important advocate and supporter of research on Irish towns, and she is a sponsor for the setting up of CFIT, the Centre for Irish Towns. So we are very much greatly indebted to her for her steadfast support and advice over the last number of years. Ali is constantly bringing people together in events like this, for example, to work collaboratively on challenges facing towns, and she's a regular contributor to debates and webinars and Oireachtas committees on all manner of issues. A very busy woman relating to our towns, and there's loads of recordings online. It's quite extraordinary how many there are now, Ali, that people can find. They include a podcast series curated and presented by Ali during lockdown called Putting Town Centres First, which has some excellent speakers, but I would avoid the first one because she interviews me in it. She has initiated and driven numerous projects in her role in the Heritage Council relating to towns. And I suppose the one that probably you're going to speak to us about today, Ali, I imagine, is the Collaborative Town Centre Health Check. Ali set that up in 2016 with no resources, and it's a huge emphasis on collaboration, including with third level institutions. So Ali has worked with the UCD School of Planning and colleagues here, Luke Kelleher and Paula Russell, and I think it was second or third year planning students with Monaghan County Council. The CTCHC is widely recognised as a very valuable approach. There are plans to grow it in the programme for government. There's about 50 plus towns on the waiting list for it. And it's also now included in the National Implementation Plan as a case study for best practice. And that's the National Implementation Plan for the UN SDGs. So I'm going to hand over to Ali now. The title of your talk, Ali, is Towns in Ireland and the Urgent Need for the Democratisation of Data.
Yeah, thanks very much. Okay, so I suppose really all I think about is, data and how we actually get it and how we get it to people, how we get it to civic leaders, business leaders. And the whole point of the CTCHC programme when I was setting it up in 2016 was that it was business leaders who came to me and said, is there anything that you can do? So today I'm going to talk about collaboration, partnership, going to talk about funding pathways, benefits and impacts of the CTCHC, which is all data driven, and also then the 4 phases of the Collaborative Town Centre Health Check. So just a wee bit of background about what we actually do. So yeah, as I say, 2016, Philip, I think you've been with me since the first workshop. So really, again, I just went around the country asking people, would they help me? I didn't have any budget in that first year, no funding whatsoever. So at the minute, we've got 15 towns, we've got 70 partners. We do workshops everywhere. We just did a workshop last week in Tipperary. And there's a 15-step methodology, which I'm going to talk about in a sec. And just to say, we've had a few awards. We've been very lucky that way. And as Philip said, we're now included in the Department of Environment's NIP for SDGs, National Implementation Plan. I have to try not to say 3-letter acronyms. It's a really bad habit of mine. So yeah, if anybody puts that up in the chat, I will die. Okay, so just to say as well, we started advocating for Town Centre First in 2019. We were collecting the data, creating the data, and it was very obvious that something, we were quite amiss in terms of what pathway we were on. So then that was included in the programme for government, and that's the actual page in the programme for government. So as I say, yeah, that was our call, we were advocating for that. I suppose it's quite strange to think that there was no national policy for town centres before that. Then just last week, okay, so this is the National Implementation Plan from the Department of Environment for SDGs, really, really important, because the OECD has come out with a report last week as well to say that we're not doing very well on our SDG delivery. Just an overview of the 6 pillars, just to sort of show you visually, who we get to collaborate, how we do it, the regional assemblies, local authorities, government departments. The 3rd levels are just so incredibly important. I could not do this programme without them. And I should also sort of, I suppose, say that I'm the daughter of a university lecturer. So yeah, I do have a bit of a love for academics and what you guys all do, what you folks all do, the ladies as well. Okay, so one of the first things that we had to do was set up a classification system, how we were going to measure land use, which is one of the key steps in the 15 steps. And this is really one of the things that I created with Dr. Luke Kelleher and Darren Burke down in Kerry County Council. So all the towns use the same classification. We have 15 towns in the programme at the minute, just to sort of show, I was trying to, I suppose Brexit had just happened or was coming up over the horizon when I was setting up this programme. So we were trying to really focus on the border towns, to make sure that we had some kind of data that could be given to the European Commission if it was required. We also have Tipperary Town there, which joined recently. So we have obviously moved the map over a wee bit to include Tipperary Town. So that's the location of the 15 towns. At the minute, I don't have the resources for the towns in the east. And as you can see, this is a waiting list for the CTCHC programme. So Drogheda is number 1 there, one of the largest towns in the state. It's really, really important that we create this, this data, as I say, it's all about the democratisation to get this information out there, because there's better decision making once you have this data, and also when you can sort of share it with the public, share it with civic leaders, there's a greater understanding of what is actually needed. So just to move on here, as I do the programme, I'm always looking at gap analysis and trying to fill in the gaps. So that's kind of what I'm obsessed with, is gap analysis. And these are the main gaps at the minute in a macro sort of system that we have. So in terms of the information on vacancy, the mapping of vacancy, that's one of the key things. We actually map it. Building condition, there's no surveys on building condition. That's phase 2 of the programme that I have. Heritage, cultural significance, it's really, really important. Like some of the local area plans that we're looking at were adopted in 2009, It's just so much, information to be filled in. Okay, so coming to the 15 steps, really, this is our secret sauce that all the towns use that are in the programme. And I try to keep quite a tight control of this methodology, because it's really about, making sure that the standards are high. So you can see that land use is step 2. It's a huge step. Once they get that done, we're trying to look at the indicators. We're trying to look at vacancy. So key thing for me is to try and find out right at the very start, where does the town sit on the vacancy sort of spectrum? Really, as you probably know, the target is 5%. Okay, so ground floor retail, you shouldn't really go above 11. So that 5 to 11% is a healthy range. And what we've got with our towns in Ireland is vacancy rates around 24%. We've just surveyed a town in the west, which is at 45%. We have another town at 31%. So just incredible in terms of the levels of vacancy in Irish towns. Footfall, business surveys, consumer surveys, all that stuff, ownership map, really, as I say, it's one of the key gaps. What we find in the town centres, for example, in Dundalk, is that the ground floor is owned by one party, the upper floor is by another family, and out the back, the lands would be owned by another family. So yeah, it's just really bringing all those layers of data together and then to launch the report. So in terms of output, you know, right at the very start, because I didn't have any resources in that first year, I just thought, right, we'll just go massively visual here. And this is part of the extract from the Sligo one. So it shows ground floor retail vacancy of 18.4%. We're looking at consumer behaviour. We're looking at perception, confidence in the town centre. We're looking at online leakage. We're looking at everything to try and find out, does this town have a pulse, and how is it sort of feeling? How's it performing? This is Tipperary's land use plan, 31.2%. Just really good to get this. I know Councillor Anne-Marie Ryan is in the call. So yeah, it's just really, really important to map this, and the way that we want to move is towards digital dashboards. So just moving on in terms of pathways to funding, there's a lot of funding out there. Different departments have different funds. I suppose really what we need is an integrated approach and join up the dots. So, you know, you've Housing for All, you have URDF, you have RRDF, you have HTI from the Heritage Council. Just to give an example of Tralee. So Tralee was the first baseline, CTCHC baseline over the line. And then a few months later, it won Most Enterprising Town in Ireland. And then as a result of all that sort of good work, the collaboration that we were all doing, it got a fund from the Heritage Council for Historic Towns Initiative. And then that led to more funding from the Department of Housing. So, I mean, yeah, we've done quite a bit in the last 5 years, 6 years, whatever, but I mean, there's so much more to do. So really, in terms of what is needed, we need a national building stock management programme. I put this into a submission for the Heritage Council on the National Planning Framework in 2017, but nothing has actually happened yet. We also need vacancy targets. There's no vacancy targets in Town Centre First, which is a bit disappointing. Also development plans, and I really want to give a shout out to the local authority planners who are, you know, putting these targets into the CDPs, into the county development plans, and also we're trying to sort of pivot the local area plans towards this. Support is needed for the CTCHC programme. Philip has already highlighted that there's a massive waiting list, and you've seen the map. Irish Towns Partnership, we do a lot of work with Scotland's Towns Partnership. They've been amazing in terms of support. And really, you know, that was one of the things I raised at the Oireachtas Housing Committee meeting back in January, that this is what I felt, my professional opinion, that we needed. CPO, CSO, compulsory sale orders, you know, other countries are doing that. In terms of our ecosystem, we only have 3 business improvement districts, 3 town scale bids in Ireland compared to Scotland, which is 40. We don't have any community development trusts, and we also, as I say, need digital dashboards. Okay, so just in terms of what we do, we've had lots of webinars. We do webinars with students. We encourage the students to run webinars. We had a webinar on compulsory sale order, which I think we had 400 people booked in for it, and I think another over 1,000 looked on it online. We also did a webinar workshop with the Irish Regions European Office to try and look at what kind of indicators do we need for our historic town centres. Clearly, vacancy is one of those, you know, key indicators that you have to get at the start. And as I say, you're not meant to be above 11%. Then in terms of the programme, you know, what are the benefits? So the benefits are even, it's a data-driven programme. Fundamentally, this is really about data. It's about making people familiar with surveying. It's making people familiar with trying to sort of say that data is a good thing, you know, that this will actually help decision-making in the country. Also create spatial data. As I say, we're talking to the UN SDGs. We really want to sort of pivot towards those. It also helps as baseline for EU funding, because it obviously supports ex-ante appraisals, which are done before you actually spend the money. And one of the things that we really want to move towards is creation of social capital, measuring that, talking about it, making sure that Ireland uses social cost benefit analysis. It's about economic appraisals, not financial appraisals as such. Also, you need an engine for regeneration. I mean, I've been working in regeneration for many years. I have 2 dissertations a long time ago on regeneration, and really it doesn't happen unless you have a delivery vehicle. So yeah, we're talking about participatory democracy, creating a focus for local communities, you know, just trying to make sure that people can work together, that there's something there for them to step onto, that there's a platform, there's an engine. Okay, and just to finish off, this is my vision for the programme, and it's very much a European vision. absolutely believe in the European experiment project, whatever. So yeah, we're talking, you know, we obviously want to link to EU directives, EU Green Deal. The new European Bauhaus movement is very important. It's great Orla's here, she's involved in that. The UCD Centre for Irish Towns is critical to this whole ecosystem that we need to create to make sure that we actually move on, we don't get stuck. As I say, the vacancy levels that we have measured and mapped in our towns are really out of kilter with what other European countries are doing. And then, as Philip said, so during lockdown, I did a podcast. I'd never actually done a podcast before. So yeah, that was a steep learning curve. And just the reach, the diaspora just started to pile on and start sending messages. So as a result of that, we've recently set up an Irish Towns Diaspora Network. So yeah, it's all going on. It's very busy and we just want to make sure that we keep going. So yeah, it really is an international flavour. It's about talking with the Europeans and making sure that we are making, you know, we're always involved with the Irish Regions European Office. That European element is just going to be so critical now to fix our town centres. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ali.